December 7, 1943, Bari Harbor, Italy. The American salvage diver signaled from 30 feet below the surface. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes watched the air bubbles break through the oily sheen and knew what was coming. He'd seen that pattern before, rapid, irregular bursts when a man was trying not to panic. The diver surfaced in a controlled descent, brass helmet breaking through water that shimmered with petroleum rainbows and something far more sinister. Before the man could speak, the deck crew was already hosing him down. Jets of clean seawater cascaded over the heavy canvas suit, washing off the thick, oily coating. The water streaming off his helmet reeked, fuel mixed with cordite and a faint garlic odor that made Hayes's eyes water even at 10 feet distance. "Another one coated bow to stern, sir," the diver reported as crew members worked the heavy helmet bolts. "Can't touch anything down there without coming up covered in this slick." 28 ships lay broken beneath Hayes's feet. 5 days after German bombers had shattered Bari's waterfront, the harbor remained a toxic graveyard. Ammunition ships, fuel tankers, supply vessels loaded with equipment for General Doolittle's 15th Air Force, and somewhere in that contaminated soup, ship number 1 on Hayes's salvage chart, the SS John Harvey, an American Liberty ship with a cargo manifest so classified that even Hayes, cleared for most operational secrets, hadn't known about it until 3 days ago. They're saying 3 months minimum to clear this mess, but they don't understand what's really down there, what's coating every wreck, every cable, every square inch of harbor bottom. Hayes watched another diver being prepared for descent. The man's hands trembled slightly as crew members checked his suit for tears. Everyone knew now. The official word had come down on December 9th. 100 tons of American mustard gas mixed with fuel oil throughout 30 acres of water. Every surface in the harbor had become a weapon. Oil-covered survivors pulled from the water on the night of December 2nd had developed mysterious blisters within hours. By December 4, men were going blind. By December 6th, they were dying, not from blast trauma or burns, but from chemical warfare poisoning. The port had to reopen. 70 miles north at Foggia, Doolittle's B-17s and B-24s sat waiting for aviation fuel and bombs. The British 8th Army needed ammunition. The Anzio amphibious assault, scheduled for late January, depended entirely on supplies flowing through this harbor. German intelligence estimated 3 months closure minimum. Washington wanted the port operational in 3 weeks. Hayes checked his watch. December 7, 1943, 1100 hours. American salvage teams had been working the harbor for 3 days. Each dive lasted 30 minutes maximum. Each diver surfaced covered in toxic oil. Each wreck required days of careful rigging. It was a race against a chemical clock. If you want to see how these divers beat a 3-month deadline in just 21 days, please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It's how we keep these stories coming. Because at Bari, the standard rules of engineering didn't just fail, they became lethal. The U.S. Navy had sent Hayes because he'd worked Pearl Harbor. He'd helped refloat battleships, but Pearl Harbor had been straightforward engineering. This was different. Every standard procedure had to be reimagined through the lens of chemical contamination. New methods would have to be invented, and Washington wanted results in 21 days. 5 days earlier, disaster had arrived on Junker's J-88 wings. On the afternoon of December 2, 1943, Captain Otto Heitmann stood on the deck of the SS John Bascom and counted ships. Too many, far too many, packed into a harbor designed for peacetime traffic. Without binoculars, he could identify the Joseph Wheeler, John L. Motley, Samuel J. Tilden, a Rustock, all American Liberty ships jammed stern to bow along the eastern jetty or anchored within the harbor walls. Bari had fallen to Allied forces on September 11, 1943, following Italy's armistice. In 12 weeks since, the port had transformed from a sleepy Adriatic fishing harbor into the primary logistics hub for Allied operations in southern Italy. More than 30 merchant ships crowded the waterfront on any given day. 30,000 troops depended on Bari for everything from tank fuel to medical supplies. The U.S. Army's 15th Air Force had established operations from the port just yesterday. General Jimmy Doolittle, famous for leading the Tokyo raid in April 1942, now ran his heavy bomber operations from a commandeered building along the waterfront. His B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators at the Foggia Airfield Complex, 70 miles north, were beginning sustained bombing operations against German targets. Every gallon of aviation fuel, every bomb, every spare part arrived by ship through Bari. The port was critical, which made it vulnerable, and Heitman, a veteran merchant captain who had survived Atlantic convoy runs, knew what that meant. At 1400 hours, a German reconnaissance aircraft appeared high over the harbor, a Messerschmitt Me-210, flying north to south at perhaps 20,000 feet. Oberleutnant Werner Hahn had been conducting observation flights over Bari for several weeks, photographing ship concentrations and port facilities. This afternoon's count confirmed what General Feldmarschall Wolfram von Richthofen, commanding Luftwaffe II, had suspected. The Allies had concentrated massive supplies in an inadequately defended port. British Air Marshal Sir Arthur Conyngham, commanding Northwest African Tactical Air Force, had held a press conference that same afternoon in Bari. Standing before assembled journalists, he declared that German air power in Italy had been effectively neutralized. "I would consider it a personal insult," Conyngham said, "if the enemy should send so much as one plane over the city." 4 hours later, at 1907 hours, radar operators at the 8010 Air Ministry Experimental Station detected 2 inbound aircraft. The contacts immediately multiplied and disintegrated into an electronic cloud. Chaff, aluminum foil strips dropped from Pathfinder aircraft, had blinded Allied radar completely. Richthofen had ordered 105 Junkers J-88 twin-engine bombers to attack Bari. The aircraft, drawn from Kampfgeschwader 30, 54, and 76, based at airfields throughout northern Italy, approached from the Adriatic at wave-top altitude to avoid radar detection. Only when level with the city did they turn west and climb to bombing altitude. Mechanical failures had reduced the strike force to 88 aircraft by the time they reached their target. What they found exceeded expectations. The harbor was illuminated like a peacetime port. Floodlights bathed the piers in white light to facilitate round-the-clock unloading operations. Security concerns had been dismissed in favor of efficiency. The ships, American, British, Polish, Norwegian, and Dutch registry, lay packed together with barely 50 feet of clearance between vessels. Many carried aviation fuel or ammunition. At 1925 hours, the first bombs fell on Bari's old town as German bombardiers calibrated their aim. Within 2 minutes they had corrected, walking explosions across the water toward the moored ships. The John L. Motley, loaded with 2,000 tons of ammunition and aviation fuel, took a direct hit at 1930. The ship exploded with a blast that shattered windows 7 miles inland. Captain Richard Hooper and his entire crew perished in the detonation. The blast wave knocked men off their feet on ships 300 yards away. The Joseph Wheeler burst into flames moments later. A severed fuel pipeline on the main pier began pumping gasoline directly into the harbor, where it ignited and spread across the water in a sheet of flame. Aboard the SS John Harvey, moored stern-on to the eastern mole, Captain Elwyn F. Knowles faced his worst nightmare. The 7,176-ton Liberty ship had arrived at Bari on November 26th, carrying a cargo manifest known only to a handful of senior commanders. 2,000 M47A1 mustard gas bombs, each containing 60 to 70 pounds of sulfur mustard agent. Total payload, approximately 100 tons of chemical weapons. President Roosevelt had approved shipment of these munitions to the Mediterranean theater in August 1943 for potential retaliatory use if Germany initiated chemical warfare. The bombs were to be stockpiled at Foggia under heavy security, but the John Harvey had arrived to find Bari's harbor congested with higher priority vessels carrying immediate combat supplies. Captain Knowles had been waiting 6 days for an unloading berth, increasingly anxious about his deadly cargo sitting in an exposed harbor. At 19:32 hours, a bomb struck the John Harvey amidships. The ship exploded with a roar that was distinct even among the other detonations, a deeper, more sustained blast that created a mushroom cloud visible from 10 miles away. Captain Knowles and his entire 63-man crew died instantly. The thin-walled M47A1 bombs, designed for aerial delivery rather than explosive resistance, shattered by the hundreds. Liquid sulfur mustard, a dense, oily substance with a specific gravity of 1.27, spilled into water already contaminated with fuel oil from other burning ships. The physics were brutally efficient. Mustard dissolved readily in petroleum products, creating a toxic emulsion that spread across the harbor's surface. Some mustard burned immediately, producing choking yellow-brown smoke. Some evaporated, forming a vapor cloud that drifted over rescue operations. Most mixed with the oil slick spreading across 30 acres of water. Ensign K. Vesol, commanding officer of the Naval Armed Guard aboard the John Bascom, was wounded by shrapnel when German bombs hit his ship. Despite severe injuries to his chest and right arm, the 22-year-old officer refused medical evacuation while enemy aircraft remained overhead. Vesol moved from gun position to gun position, directing his crew and assisting wounded men. When the John L. Motley exploded at 19:30, the blast wave knocked Vesol unconscious. He fell into water heavily contaminated with mustard agent and fuel oil. Rescue crews pulled him from the burning harbor and rushed him to the 98th British General Hospital. His wounds were treated. He was expected to survive. By 1950 hours, the raid was over. German bombers disappeared into the night, having lost only 2 aircraft. Behind them, Bari Harbor burned. 17 merchant ships had been sunk outright. 8 more were damaged beyond immediate repair. More than 1,000 military personnel and merchant seamen were dead or missing. The number of civilian casualties, Italian dock workers, port personnel, and citizens living near the waterfront would never be accurately determined. The British Eighth Army's advance toward Rome depended on supplies flowing through Bari. The U.S. 15th Air Force's bombing campaign against German oil refineries at Ploiești, Romania, required aviation fuel delivered through this port. The planned amphibious assault at Anzio in January was contingent on Bari remaining operational. The port was devastated. But as rescue crews worked through the night pulling survivors from the oil-covered water, the real catastrophe was still developing invisibly on the skin of hundreds of men. Within 12 hours of the raid, medical staff at the 98th British General Hospital noticed something wrong. Patients complained of eye irritation, then skin redness on oil-covered areas, then blisters, large, painful vesicles that appeared wherever fuel oil had contacted skin for extended periods. Men who had bathed immediately after rescue and changed into clean clothes showed minimal symptoms. Those who had slept in oil-soaked clothing developed blisters across 30 to 50% of their bodies. The pattern was unusual. These weren't burn injuries from fire or blast trauma. The blisters appeared hours after exposure, not immediately. They developed in proportion to oil contact, feet and legs for men who had waded through contaminated water, entire torsos for those who had been fully submerged. By December 3rd, the symptoms became more alarming. Patients were going blind, not from blast injuries or flash burns, but from chemical conjunctivitis. Respiratory problems appeared, harsh coughing, labored breathing, fluid accumulation in lungs. Blood samples showed precipitous drops in white blood cell counts. Men were dying of what appeared to be massive infections, their immune systems inexplicably compromised. HMS Bixter, the British destroyer that had escaped the harbor during the raid, provided the most dramatic evidence. The ship had taken on numerous oil-covered survivors before threading its way past burning wrecks and setting course for Taranto, 120 miles northeast. During the 6-hour voyage, strange symptoms appeared among the crew. Men who had handled contaminated survivors developed painful blisters across their hands and arms. Others experienced vision problems. By the time Bixter reached Taranto on the morning of December 3rd, her navigation officers were functionally blind from chemical conjunctivitis. The destroyer had to request assistance from shore to safely berth. Her entire bridge crew could not see well enough to navigate the harbor entrance. At Bari, the death toll climbed. December 3rd, 12 dead. December 4th, 26. December 5th, 38. The progression was consistent but baffling. Doctors treated for burns, shock, exposure. Nothing worked. Patients would stabilize briefly, show signs of improvement, then suffer sudden deterioration and death. Colonel William H. Laird, commanding officer of the 98th British General Hospital, faced 628 hospitalized patients exhibiting symptoms he couldn't explain. An equal number of Italian civilians sought treatment at city hospitals, further straining medical capacity. The hospitals had no protocol for chemical casualties. Chemical warfare had been banned by the Geneva Protocol of 1925. This was 1943. Who would expect mustard gas in an Allied-controlled port? The U.S. 26th General Hospital, scheduled to deploy to Bari specifically to support Doolittle's air operations, had lost most of its equipment when the supply ship carrying it was sunk in the raid. American casualties requiring hospitalization were transferred to British medical facilities. Wards exceeded capacity within days. Casualties spilled into hallways. Medical staff, working without protective equipment while handling contaminated patients and clothing, began developing symptoms themselves. And still, officially, no one knew what was killing them. British port authorities, when questioned, denied that any Allied ship carried chemical weapons. The manifest of the John Harvey had been classified at the highest security level. Captain Knowles and his entire crew, the only personnel who knew with certainty what the ship carried, were all dead. Every document pertaining to the cargo had been destroyed when the ship exploded. The secret seemed buried beneath 30 feet of contaminated water. But the dying continued. Each day brought new casualties. Each shift brought medical personnel into contact with contaminated clothing, bedding, and personal effects. Each hour of treatment without understanding the causative agent meant more men slipping beyond saving. American merchant sailors who had survived Atlantic convoy runs, who had dodged U-boats from Murmansk to Malta, lay dying in Bari from a cause their doctors couldn't identify. The irony was savage. These men had come through years of combat only to be poisoned by an Allied weapon in an Allied port. On December 6th, 4 days after the raid, Ensign K. Vasol died at the 98th General Hospital. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his actions during the attack. The citation read, "His exceptional fortitude and self-sacrificing concern for others were in keeping with the highest tradition of the United States Naval Service. He gallantly gave his life for his country." What the citation didn't mention, what couldn't be mentioned because the official cover-up had already begun, was that Vasol died from American mustard gas, not German bombs. For every hour that medical personnel treated symptoms without understanding the cause, more men joined him. At 1700 hours on December 7, 1943, 5 days after the raid, a Douglas C-47 transport touched down at Bari's airfield carrying the only man in the Mediterranean theater qualified to solve the mystery. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Francis Alexander, age 27, served as chemical warfare consultant to General Dwight D. Eisenhower's medical staff. He had traveled from Allied Force headquarters in Algiers with a single mission: determine what was killing Allied servicemen at Bari. Alexander had trained at the U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service facility at Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, the premier American research center for chemical weapons development and defense. He had accompanied General Patton's Western Task Force during the November 1942 North Africa landings as consultant in chemical warfare medicine. He knew mustard gas, its effects, its treatment protocols, its tactical deployment characteristics. And within hours of arriving at the 98th British General Hospital, he recognized the symptoms. The clinical presentation was unmistakable: conjunctivitis, producing temporary or permanent blindness, severe respiratory distress, vesicant blistering in patterns corresponding to skin contact with liquid agent, dramatic immunosuppression measured through white blood cell counts, and delayed mortality occurring 72 to 96 hours post-exposure. This was sulfur mustard poisoning. But the exposure pattern was highly unusual. Traditional mustard gas deployment, artillery shells or aerial bombs releasing vapor clouds, caused injury primarily through inhalation. These patients showed symptoms consistent with prolonged skin contact with liquid mustard. Their blistering followed the exact pattern of oil coating documented in rescue reports. Men who had been completely submerged showed burns over their entire bodies. Those who had only gotten their feet wet developed blisters only on their lower extremities. Survivors who had washed the oil off immediately and changed clothes showed minimal effects or none at all. "Colonel Laird," Alexander said carefully, "I believe these men have been exposed to mustard agent in some manner. Do you have any knowledge of how this might have occurred?" Laird didn't. British port authorities, when Alexander approached them, were evasive. They denied knowledge of chemical weapons stockpiled in Bari. They suggested Alexander was mistaken. Perhaps these were unusual burn injuries from the fires. Perhaps contaminated fuel oil alone could produce such symptoms, but Alexander was cleared to the highest security level. He knew the Allies had begun secretly stockpiling poison gas in forward theaters as insurance against German first use. Roosevelt had publicly stated that any Axis employment of chemical weapons would be met with immediate retaliation. That policy required pre-positioned stocks, and Alexander suspected Bari port officials were lying to protect operational security. He began methodical investigation. He interviewed every conscious survivor he could locate, documenting their position in the harbor during the raid, their level of oil immersion, their decontamination procedures, and their subsequent medical timeline. He ordered autopsies on the deceased, personally supervising tissue preservation. He sketched the harbor layout, mapping ship positions based on witness testimony and comparing notes with port records. The pattern was clear. Most deaths clustered around a single location in the eastern basin, ship number 1 on Alexander's sketch. British authorities initially refused to identify the vessel, but Alexander was persistent. He cross-referenced survivor testimony with cargo manifests and ship registry data. On December 9th, Alexander received a phone call that confirmed his suspicions. American salvage divers searching the harbor floor had recovered bomb casings. Chemical tests performed on-site revealed traces of mustard agent. Ordnance specialists identified the casings as American M47A1 100-pound bombs, a munition designed to carry either white phosphorus or liquid sulfur mustard for area denial operations. German mustard bombs were always marked with the distinctive Gelb Kreuz, the yellow cross chemical weapon identification symbol. These casings bore American ordnance markings. They were definitely U.S. manufacture. Ship position data correlated perfectly. Ship number 1, the vessel whose explosion had created the largest blast signature and the most persistent fires, was the SS John Harvey. British port officials, confronted with physical evidence and Alexander's security clearance, reluctantly confirmed the truth. The John Harvey had carried 2,000 M47A1 mustard gas bombs destined for stockpile at Foggia. When German bombs struck the ship on December 2, those chemical weapons had exploded, releasing approximately 100 tons of sulfur mustard agent into the harbor. By December 11th, Alexander submitted his preliminary findings to Allied Force headquarters in Algiers. The contamination was massive and persistent. Liquid mustard had mixed with fuel oil to create a toxic emulsion spread across at least 30 acres of harbor surface and contaminating the water column to unknown depths clothes. The mixture was more dangerous than mustard alone. Oil enhanced skin penetration and prolonged contact time, increasing agent absorption. Men pulled from the water on the night of December 2 had been effectively bathed in chemical weapons, then wrapped in contaminated blankets and transported to hospitals, where they contaminated medical staff. The hospital admissions themselves had spread the agent to clean environments. Laundry facilities processing contaminated clothing and bedding had exposed workers to toxic residue. The entire medical response had been compromised by lack of information. The response from Allied command was swift and classified. General Eisenhower accepted Alexander's diagnosis and authorized appropriate medical treatment. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, concerned about diplomatic and strategic implications, refused to acknowledge the presence of mustard gas in official records. With the war in Europe entering a critical phase, the Anzio landing scheduled for January 22, the strategic bombing campaign against German oil production at Ploesti dependent on continued air operations from Foggia, both leaders agreed to impose strict censorship. All mention of mustard gas was stricken from casualty reports. Deaths were attributed to burns due to enemy action. Medical charts were altered. Hospital staff received orders to maintain silence. The cover-up was systematic and complete. For the American salvage teams working Bari Harbor, Alexander's findings had immediate and sobering implications. The harbor wasn't just physically blocked by wreckage, it was chemically contaminated on a scale unprecedented in naval history. Every sunken hull carried a coating of oily mustard. Every submerged cable, every anchor chain, every square foot of harbor bottom silt, all of it was toxic. Standard salvage procedures required divers in close physical contact with wrecks. Cutting through steel with underwater torches produced heat and sparks, potentially vaporizing mustard residue. Pumping operations would circulate contaminated water throughout the basin. Traditional approaches would kill the salvage crews before the first wreck cleared the channel. New methods would have to be invented immediately and tested under conditions where failure meant death. The engineering problem facing American salvage teams at Bari was unlike anything in naval warfare history. The harbor contained approximately 34,000 tons of cargo in 17 sunken vessels and an unknown quantity of mustard agent dispersed throughout the water column. U.S. Navy salvage experts arrived on December 5th. They brought experience from Pearl Harbor, where they had refloated battleships considered total losses. But Bari was different. At Pearl Harbor, divers could work in direct contact with wrecks. At Bari, contact meant death. British planners initially estimated 3 months to restore partial operations, assuming standard wreckage removal. However, the mustard contamination invalidated every assumption underlying salvage doctrine. Unlike chlorine or tear gas, which disperse rapidly, sulfur mustard is an oily liquid with remarkable persistence. Mixed with fuel oil and protected from sunlight by the slick, the agent showed no signs of degrading. The requirements were straightforward but seemingly impossible. Clear the 17 sunken ships, restore the piers, and reopen the harbor for the Anzio landings, less than 7 weeks away, all while preventing divers from touching the water's deadliest elements. There was no doctrine for this. Standard 1943 diving suits, canvas with brass helmets and rubber seals, were designed for pressure and cold, not chemical warfare. Mustard dissolved readily in rubber and penetrated canvas within minutes. A single tear, normally a manageable equipment failure, would be a death sentence. American Navy salvage specialists, coordinating with British authorities, developed an experimental approach born of desperation. The procedures established at Bari would lay the groundwork for hazardous materials recovery used decades later. Key operational protocols. Diver protection. Suits underwent microscopic inspection for every dive. Divers worked in pairs with strict 30-minute limits to minimize exposure. Upon surfacing, they were immediately hosed down with clean seawater before their helmets were removed, a non-negotiable 15-minute decontamination cycle. Remote handling. Whenever possible, ships were lifted using heavy steel cables passed beneath hulls by divers, but hauled by steam winches on barges positioned outside the contaminated zone. This allowed wreck movement with minimal diver contact time. Selective recovery. Only wrecks blocking the main channel were prioritized. Damaged ships that could be moved were dragged to shallow water near the harbor periphery, deferring complete recovery until the crisis passed. Progressive decontamination. Teams started with the least contaminated wrecks near the harbor entrance, allowing natural tidal circulation to gradually reduce mustard concentrations in the inner harbor. Work began on December 8th, even as the specific agent was still being confirmed by tissue analysis. Progress was measured in feet per day. Each wreck required careful assessment to determine lift points that wouldn't break the hull and release more poison. The controlled lift phase was the most dangerous. If cables slipped or plating failed, the wreck could break apart underwater. Divers reported seeing the oily sheen on every surface below the waterline. The characteristic garlic odor of mustard agent was detectable even through their helmets when pumps disturbed bottom sediment. By December 15th, 3 wrecks had been moved. By December 20th, the main channel was partially cleared, enough for single-file transit. Limited cargo operations resumed on December 23rd, 3 weeks after the raid. Full restoration took until February 1944. It required 2 months of intensive work to overcome a disaster German intelligence predicted would close the port for 6 months. The difference was not technology. The U.S. Navy had no specialized anti-chemical gear. The solution was American engineering solved through innovation under pressure, ruthless pragmatism, and the acceptance of casualties as the price of mission success. The sailors who died from mustard poisoning at Bari never saw their killer. The divers who died clearing the harbor knew exactly what would kill them and descended anyway. Ensign K. Visol never regained consciousness after being pulled from the water. The 22-year-old officer had directed his gun crews under fire and assisted wounded men despite his own severe injuries. He died 4 days after the raid. His family received notification he was killed in action. His Navy Cross citation praised his fortitude but mentioned only enemy action. Neither document mentioned mustard gas. This pattern repeated across hospital wards. Merchant seamen who had survived the frozen hell of Murmansk convoys died in Bari from a weapon their own side had brought to the battlefield. Medical staff, under strict orders to maintain the cover-up, watched helpless as white blood cell counts dropped and bodies failed despite aggressive intervention. They could not tell dying men why standard burn treatments weren't working. The salvage divers faced comparable risks with full knowledge of the danger. U.S. Navy diver William Thompson, working on the wreck of the Lars Cruise on December 14, suffered a tear in his canvas suit less than 2 inches long. In normal waters, this was a minor inconvenience. In Bari, it was catastrophic. Despite a controlled emergency ascent, mustard-contaminated water penetrated his suit. Within hours, blistering covered his legs and groin. Thompson survived, but he required 3 months of hospitalization and suffered permanent respiratory damage. He was not alone. Records are incomplete. The cover-up extended to salvage casualties, but estimates suggest between 5 and 10 salvage personnel died or suffered serious long-term injuries during the clearance operations. Survivors reported chronic health problems for years, respiratory issues, inexplicable skin flare-ups, and neurological symptoms. They made the trade of future health for immediate operational success willingly because the strategic situation demanded it. On shore, the toll was equally insidious. Stevedores handling recovered cargo developed blistering on their hands from rope and crates coated in mustard residue. One American dock worker suffered severe chemical burns across his back when a leaking fuel drum soaked his shirt. The contamination was so persistent that most recovered equipment had to be destroyed rather than cleaned. The civilian population of Bari, however, faced the highest casualties and received the least care. When the vapor cloud from the John Harvey drifted inland, it blanketed the densely populated old city. Hundreds of Italian civilians, families, shopkeepers, dock workers developed symptoms within hours. Most fled to the countryside, beyond the reach of overwhelmed hospitals and away from the cursed air. They were never counted in official casualty figures. To this day, the true civilian death toll remains unknown. Official records listed 83 deaths among military personnel from confirmed mustard exposure. The actual total, including uncounted civilians and those who died later from complications, likely ranges between 1,000 and 2,000. For the U.S. 15th Air Force, the Bari disaster had immediate tactical consequences. The raid destroyed aviation fuel stockpiles sufficient for 2 weeks of operations. The SS Samuel J. Tilden, carrying critical radar and navigation systems for precision bombing, was a total loss. Replacement equipment would take weeks to ship from the United States. During that interval, heavy bomber operations continued with degraded navigation capability, reducing accuracy and increasing collateral damage. The ripples reached the front lines. When Allied forces landed at Anzio on January 22, 1944, the 15th Air Force struggled to provide adequate close air support. German Field Marshal Kesselring rapidly contained the beachhead, turning a campaign meant to be a rapid advance on Rome into a 4-month grinding battle of attrition. One of the contributing factors to the slaughter at Anzio was the supply chain disruption and equipment loss at Bari. The strategic impact extended even further. The 15th Air Force was tasked with destroying the oil refineries at Ploiești, Romania, which supplied 30% of Germany's fuel. Delays in bringing the Air Force to full capability meant continued German access to that fuel through early 1944. Every week of delayed bombing translated to thousands of tons of fuel for the Wehrmacht. Each sortie not flown meant German tanks and aircraft remained operational longer and Allied casualties mounted higher. Every casualty suffered in Italy through early 1944 could be traced in some measure back to that December night when German bombs released American chemical weapons into a harbor the Allies had assumed was safe. The raid, December 2, 1943. 105 German J-88 bombers launched. 88 reached target, 30 Allied merchant ships in harbor, 17 ships sunk, 11 damaged beyond immediate repair, 38,000 tons of cargo destroyed, 1,000+ military and merchant personnel killed or missing from raid. Estimated 200 to 500 civilian casualties, never officially counted. Luftwaffe losses, 2 aircraft. Port closed for 3 weeks. Chemical contamination. SS John Harvey cargo, 2,000 M47A1 mustard bombs, 60 to 70 pounds each. Total agent released approximately 100 tons. Contaminated area, 30 to 40 acres of harbor surface. 628 confirmed mustard casualties among military and merchant personnel. 83 deaths directly attributed to mustard exposure. 13.2% mortality rate. Medical staff affected, dozens developed symptoms. Salvage operations. Port closed December 2nd to 23rd, 1943. 21 days. Limited operations resumed December 23, 1943. Full capacity restored February 1944. Main channel cleared, 8 wrecks by December 31st. Salvage casualties estimated 5 to 10 deaths or serious injuries. 15th Air Force impact. Supplies lost, aviation fuel. 2+ weeks operations, bombs, radar, and navigation equipment. Equipment value $10 million, 1943 dollars. Operational readiness delayed 2 to 4 weeks. Sortie capability reduced 15 to 20% through January 1944. Impact on Anzio contributed to inadequate air support. On February 15, 1944, Bari officially returned to full operational capacity, 2 months and 13 days after German bombs released 100 tons of American mustard gas. Ships unloaded at normal rates. The channel was clear, piers rebuilt, toxic water diluted to non-lethal concentrations. The operation German intelligence projected would take 3 to 6 months succeeded in 10 weeks. American engineering had overcome contamination that should have rendered the harbor unusable indefinitely. But the cost wasn't measured just in the 83 confirmed deaths from mustard exposure that made Bari the worst chemical weapons disaster of World War II. The greater cost was measured in principles abandoned and lessons suppressed. The cover-up ordered by Churchill and Eisenhower achieved its objective. Germany never learned Allied chemical weapons had been stockpiled in a forward port. Hitler never used Bari as justification for initiating gas warfare. The strategic calculus was coldly rational, but suppression also prevented medical communities from learning critical lessons. Proper mustard exposure treatment protocols existed in 1943. Had doctors known from the first hours, mortality rates could have been halved. The delay killed men who could have been saved. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander's meticulous documentation became the foundation for an unexpected breakthrough. In 1946, Yale researchers examining Alexander's Bari data recognized something extraordinary. Nitrogen mustard's ability to suppress white blood cell production, what killed so many at Bari, suggested it might be weaponized against cancer. Colonel Cornelius P. Rhodes, Alexander's superior and director of Memorial Hospital for Cancer Treatment, immediately grasped the implications. Mustard's selective toxicity toward fast-multiplying cells made it potential treatment for lymphoma and leukemia. By 1949, Mustargin, mechlorethamine, became the first FDA-approved chemotherapeutic drug. The American Cancer Society would credit Bari with initiating modern chemotherapy development, a field that has saved millions of lives. The irony was complete. A weapon designed to kill became medicine targeting malignancy. A disaster covered up became foundation for therapeutic revolution. The 83 men who died contributed unknowingly to treatments benefiting humanity beyond their wartime sacrifice. Bari's immediate lessons concerned crisis response and operational security. Stockpiling chemical weapons in a forward port without adequate defense led to catastrophe. Failing to inform medical personnel delayed treatment. The cover-up prevented systematic learning for 16 years. Post-war U.S. doctrine incorporated multiple Bari lessons. Hazardous cargoes would be distributed across vessels and ports. Medical facilities would maintain chemical casualty treatment capability even where gas warfare seemed unlikely. Port authorities would be informed with appropriate security protocols. The salvage techniques developed at Bari, protective protocols, remote handling, selective recovery, progressive decontamination, established principles still employed in hazardous materials recovery today. Doolittle's 15th Air Force eventually achieved full capability and contributed significantly to destroying German petroleum production. Anzio succeeded strategically despite higher costs. The Italian campaign ground toward Rome. Bari's strategic impact, while measurable in weeks and casualties, didn't alter the war's outcome. What remained was human cost. Men who died from a weapon their side brought, and salvage crews who descended into toxic water. Their sacrifice, recorded in classified documents and altered charts, remained hidden 16 years. When truth emerged in 1959, the world learned the worst chemical weapons disaster of World War II was self-inflicted, that the most dangerous weapons are sometimes ones you bring yourself, that in crisis, innovation and courage can overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Bari Harbor is peaceful today. Modern shipping moves through channels American divers cleared. Wrecks are gone, contamination faded. But beneath routine commerce, sediment still holds molecular traces of that December night when 100 tons of mustard gas turned a strategic port into a proving ground for both death and eventually healing. The men who died proved the real cost of war is measured not in strategic objectives, but in lives forever altered by decisions made far from the battlefield.